Welcome, everyone, to our distinguished lecture for African Studies series this year. I'm Jenny Trinitopoli. I'm new to the university in the Department of Sociology. And I'm very pleased today to be introducing Jim Smith from UC Davis and introducing him in a welcome home kind of way. Jim received his PhD from here in anthropology in 2002. And has gone on to do all of the things that people who receive their PhDs in anthropology are supposed to do, right? Books with U of C Press, with University of California Press, papers in American Ethnologist, and all of the other leading journals in the area. Jim was recently promoted to full professor, and I think that we'll appreciate the sort of quick ascension in looking at new findings from a new project that really is the third of a series of very, very distinct projects. So with that, I will keep the introduction short so our distinguished guests can have all of the time and appreciate being back in his home court in a new position of authority. So thank you very much for making the trip.
Thank you, Jenny, for that very, very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here, and it's great to be back home. So I want to thank the African Studies Workshop for inviting me. How's that? This. Good? Okay. Anyone who's ever watched a TED Talk, any of the 4 different movies about Steve Jobs, or the popular television show Silicon Valley is already well versed in the alluring American narrative regarding how future-directed individuals have pitted their indomitable wills against cultural and political traditions inherited from the past. Linked to this romance is the notion that we can, quote, save everything, all historic socially produced situations by, quote, clicking here, as Evgeny Morozov mockingly puts it in his critical discussion of techno-solutionism, to save everything, click here. But it hardly bears reminding that the digital age has proceeded alongside the global expansion of artisanal mining in the context of post-Fordist neoliberalism, including artisanal mining of the very substances that make the ever smaller devices of the digital age possible. And so we are compelled to ask now as much as ever before, who and even what really makes the technologies on which we depend? This is a big question, and here I'm going to be talking about a very small piece of it. In my larger ongoing work on this topic, I show how Congolese social infrastructure, geological history, and invisible worlds help make the information age possible while examining how Congolese make and understand the process through which the animated potency of the ground comes to be turned into a resource, commodified and converted into technologies with their own animate life. In the process, I show how Eastern Congolese use these minerals to produce incremental temporality in their personal lives and in the larger social world, in the wake of extreme precarity brought about by war and dependence on highly volatile substances whose values fluctuate radically. For the last 10 years, I've been conducting ethnographic research in the Eastern Congo, the Kivus and Maniema province, on the impact of the global demand for minerals used in electronic and digital devices on people there. I began by focusing on coltan, the ore from which tantalum and niobium are derived. These minerals are used to make electronic capacitors and are what enables us to have small, ever smaller digital devices. Coltan is similar in appearance to and often found alongside other minerals that are equally crucial for digital technologies, especially wolframite, the ore from which tungsten is derived, and cassiterite, from which tin is derived. There's a picture of wolframite drying in the sun. Tungsten is used to make computer screens and also enables cell phones to vibrate. Tin is used in wiring, amongst many other processes. These minerals are often found together in the same site at different times and appear remarkably similar to each other, leading to a great deal of confusion and deceit between diggers and traders, since these substances fetch very different prices at different times. I soon found that diggers and traders don't specialize in specific minerals, and that the social lives of these minerals are connected to one another, so I broadened my lens to artisanal mining, focusing on what international NGOs call the 3 T's: tantalum, tin, and tungsten, or what Congolese call the black minerals, or sometimes just coltan. These ores are materially and socially dense, allowing for the creation of elaborate social networks, divisions of labor, and grassroots forms of artisanal governance that are relatively visible. Congolese contrast the future potentials of these minerals with those of more easily concealed and inscrutable minerals, such as gold and diamonds, which armed groups prefer to control and smuggle. More recently, I've been examining international efforts to regulate the 3 T's, including the impact of the American Dodd-Frank Act and, quote, bag and tag tracking schemes sponsored by Intel, Hewlett-Packard, Motorola, and others, which hope to brand the minerals used in their devices conflict-free. This is an Intel presentation on conflict-free bag and tag schemes. In these interventions, the naive techno-solutionism of what in Euro-America gets called the digital age comes full circle to act on the complexity and movement of Congolese life and mining, with results that are often counterproductive and counterintuitive, which is why I chose to call this talk Taking the Life Out of Mining, as opposed to taking the blood out, which is how companies imagine their work. These tracking schemes will be the main subject of this talk, but before I get there, I'm going to have to talk about some other things. Oh, and I'm going to have to open up this bottle. Some background. Congolese minerals, most famously coltan, but others as well, played a pivotal role in what is often described as Africa's First World War, between roughly 1996 and 2005, and really still ongoing. This war, in which more lives have been lost than in any single conflict since World War II, involved at least 9 African countries, as well as international players and corporations. The demand for minerals was not the cause of this war, at least not in any simple sense. The causes were multiple and operated at very different scales, but were related to the overflow of the Rwandan genocide into the Eastern Congo in the mid-1990s. But during the war, in late 2000, the price for coltan went up tenfold in a matter of months, partly in response to Sony running out of the tantalum needed to meet the Christmas demand for Sony PlayStation 2, which triggered online speculation. According to a 2002 UN report, 85 firms from 20 countries, including Anglo-American, Barclays, Bayer, Cabot, H.C. Stark, and Standard Chartered Bank, collaborated with occupying armies or illegal militias during the war. The UN recommended sanctions on 29 firms from Britain, the US, Germany, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and Belgium, but these sanctions were never implemented. The demand for minerals by foreign armies and companies fueled the American dollarization of the Congolese economy, which had many dramatic ramifications that continue to affect people to this day. The price for coltan dropped back down again after about a year, from $100 to $10 a kilo, leaving people holding sand and debt as regional investors, many of them occupying soldiers, demanded back the money that they had forwarded to buyers so that they could venture into the forest to buy this stuff. Coltan is mostly located in rainforests. The resulting indebtedness on the part of those who purchase this substance using different sorts of loans, usually interest-bearing ones, impacted everyone from urban entrepreneurs to low-level diggers, many of whom continued to stay in the mining business to pay their debts or escape debts while living in the forest far from home. Some diggers say they became addicted, I use that word, addicted, to mining at this time. The period of the coltan price hike, known amongst miners and traders as the fois deux, the doubling, and Bisie, may it not be broken, or may it never end, was in many ways paradoxical. It is remembered as being at once a time of great violence, and for those involved in the trade, of great, quote-unquote, movement, a French word that is used to describe an economic activity, but more than that, I'll get to it. Look, the Congo's calling right now because of coltan. A time of great violence and of great movement and wealth creation, a time when almost anything could happen and urban worlds materialized in the most unlikely places, including the middle of a forest with no roads for 100 miles. Amongst mine workers, Bisie is also described as a time of democratization, when many Congolese first came to know about the value of these minerals from the Rwandan invaders who were looking for them. They also came to know about mobile phones, which only work because of coltan at the same time. For a decade now, a group of international NGOs have joined journalists and others in making the case for, quote, conflict-free minerals, unquote, by arguing that our demand for minerals and our consumption of high-tech electronics has funded lawlessness and war in the DR Congo. The work of international NGOs like the Enough Project and Global Witness has resulted in different forms of conflict minerals legislation, notably Section 1502 of the American Dodd-Frank Act, intended to regulate the banking industry. Known as Obama's Law in Congo, it compels American companies to reveal whether the minerals in their devices originated in the DRC or any adjoining country, to report on the due diligence undertaken to examine the supply chain, and to take measures if the minerals are not conflict-free, or as Congolese in the trade put it, kutosha damu, to get the blood out of the stones. Some companies have in turn made conflict-free a kind of brand signifier, like sugar-free or GMO-free. Obama's law informed President Joseph Kabila's decision to shut down the artisanal mineral trade in the eastern Congo completely for 6 months in 2010. Later it was reopened, but not everywhere, and with restrictions. When he did this, prices and production in the Kivus and Maniema decreased by between 80% and 90%. Placing people in crushing poverty, in many cases starvation, and causing some to join the very militias that the law's passing was intended to squelch. This is a picture of a cargo plane. This is really the only way to get back and forth from the towns to Walikale, which is one of the main places where I've been conducting research. You can't go by road. So when the minerals stop running, the planes stop flying as well, and people run out of all kinds of things. And prices go way up. Despite this history and the precarity of price, artisanal mining has been the main way in which people who have lost their land, livestock, and wares during the war started to rebuild and create social life and temporal continuity. Today, there are about 2 million artisanal miners in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and an estimated 10 million people dependent on mining. It would not be too far-fetched to say that the creation of divisions of labor, cross-cutting social networks, and incremental time through mining is the main peace-building activity in many parts of the eastern Congo, more meaningful and enduring than disarmament campaigns, elections, and the integration of armed combatants into the army. This is confusing to international observers and regulators because those involved in the trade, such as soldiers who offer protection in exchange for minerals or fees, are not legally supposed to be there and are considered to be criminals or worse by the human rights community. Though NGOs and lawmakers see the black minerals as the conflict minerals par excellence, Congolese miners and traders often argue that these minerals are, again, unlike gold and diamonds, peace-building minerals because they have incrementally realized social value and enable many people to touch money, kugusa makuta. Artisanal mining also has a strongly democratic and politically transformative dimension, elevating marginalized people to positions of importance and generating new social formations that can take on the state or even become the state. Take, for example, a very successful artisanal miner nicknamed Lagom, the rubbers or flip-flops, a once impoverished digger who actually succeeded in becoming the state for a time in the town of Punya in Manyema province. That's him to my left. One might be ashamed to enter the city of Kisangani without good shoes, and your friends might look down on you for having to wear them in town. But at the end of the day, everyone has to go to the bathroom, and so everyone has to wear Lagom, flip-flops. And so too, anyone in the town of Punya who wanted anything would sooner or later have to come to Lagom, the despised, looked down upon thing that everybody needs, and which is proof of the fundamental sameness of everyone. People also called Lagom Kikombe, or cup, because everybody had to drink from him. And little kids sing a song about how Lagom is the father of the WC, the king of the toilet. Lagom was successful, not mainly because he knew about minerals. He had maps that he inherited from his father, who worked for the Belgian mining company before a major price decline in the 1980s. He was an excellent architect of social forms, of an extractive apparatus which he once boasted to me was better than a machine. Using uprooted people, he helps build social networks that are supple, that's another Congolese term, to be supple, souple, and responsive to fluctuating global demands. Because of Lagom's success, many state officials approached him looking to collect tax or fees. Fed up, he went to the city of Kisangani, formerly Stanleyville, and paid off some bigwig in ANR, the not-so-secret Congolese police, something like the FBI, so that he could become the director of ANR in Chamaka, where the mine is. Once that happened, Lagom was the state. The other state authorities no longer had any authority over him, and so left him alone. He even assumed certain state functions, paying civilians to build roads and repair bridges, for example. He went on to become very popular amongst the youth for incentivizing police and other state authorities to disappear. He famously paid the police to go away for several months. While figures like Lagom make a lot of Congolese uncomfortable because they suggest the decline of an earlier state-centered mining order in which authority was vested in seniors, they also demonstrate the ability of artisanal miners to create reliable social and material infrastructures from the bottom up. I have in mind here what Malik Simone calls people as infrastructure. These are pictures of people digging, women washing the minerals. Conversations with the machine. The machine smokes a lot. He jokingly assures me that the smoke from the cigarette doesn't have time to remain in his body and cause harm because he's always working and sweating. He dramatically enacts the movement entailed in breathing and digging for me, blowing in and out with great force while moving his arms as if to prove his point, demonstrating to me what life was like when the artisanal mine at Bisie, it's a large artisanal mine that I'll talk more about, was still open, and he had as much money as he could earn from his sweat. The machine jumps around the bar, pouring imaginary people imaginary drinks, eating invisible meat, and paying for fictive medicines for the fictive sick. He has since been immobilized by the government's closure of Bisie and is embodying the memory of movement for me, so I too can experience this now vanished quality, movement is a value that artisanal miners frequently invoke to discuss their own movement, as well as the movement of people, things, and money to different, often highly unlikely places in the DRC. This, by the way, this is a village that was at one time called Kigali 2, because there were so many Rwandan businessmen and soldiers there, and you could buy anything that you could buy in Rwanda. And it's near a coltan mine. But then it closed, and now it's back to being the village of Ngongo, where you can't buy a bar of soap, people like to point out. The term movement also refers to the back and forth conversion of different quasi-signs of value, to invoke Nancy Munn, enabled by the work of mining. This extractive work is not a straightforward matter, nor is it mainly an economic activity. It is a total ritualized act of transforming the value potentials that are immanent in the ground and in different substances and materials. For diggers, successful mining requires an intimate knowledge of minerals, as well as the lives and worlds in which minerals are enmeshed, and a willingness on the part of artisanal miners to engage with forces and histories that many Congolese prefer to avoid, because they see these things as dirty, chafu, in the total sense of the word. This symbolic work comes across in the intimate way miners talk about these substances. For example, the machine, who I'm talking to at the bar, says that coltan, the fecund mother of all minerals, in his phrasing, resembles generative goat shit. Oh, that's goat shit. This is another walking through the forest, showing how difficult it is to get to these mines. And I found a picture of goat shit on the internet. Goat shit that has a lot of fat in it. It's black and shiny. Casterite, on the other hand, is like black clothes that have been washed many times and are not really black anymore. Diggers commune with the morally ambivalent and violent forces and histories that exist underground and convert them into commodities, and they bear the moral opprobrium associated with these realms of existence on their bodies, even though it is their work that also makes it possible to buy a bar of soap in what would otherwise be remote places, a point that those in the mining trade like to point out. If it weren't for us, you wouldn't be able to buy a bar of soap here. It is telling that many diggers make a point of not washing their work clothes and always wearing the same clothes to work, because they feel they can only engage with and obtain the minerals they seek if they remain part of the animate earth themselves. Channeling the animate potency of the earth typically means entering into dialogue with ancestors and sometimes other spirit entities through dreams and rituals. Even a Toronto-based company like Alphamine, which now claims the right to prospect in the mine at Bisie, if it wants to be successful, has to pass through local customary authorities at the mine, who in turn communicate with ancestors. Typically, this means that the living talk to the most recent generation of dead, so that these recently deceased can then elaborate to the third and fourth generations of dead about the importance of money, the workings of debt, and the inability of the forest to take care of the needs of the living in contemporary times, when animal populations have been greatly diminished by commercial hunting. You might say that the very dead need to have these things explained to them by the somewhat dead, or the recent dead. Ancestors aren't incarcerated in one indigenous territory. Like diggers and traders, they are also on the move. The machine may be from Goma, but his Shi ancestors, Shi is an ethnic group, his Shi ancestors follow him to the mine and secure his success, often in opposition to the Bakumu ancestors of customary authorities, who are recognized as the Bisie autochthones, the autochthones of this mine at Bisie. Even European UN employees are said to make sacrifices to their own ancestors who worked for Belgian mining companies in order to get minerals out of the ground. In fact, Maps and sacrifice have to be used together in order to act on the multiple ontological domains involved in mining. The maps are for seeing, but the sacrifice is for extracting or separating minerals from the dense web of relations in which they're embedded. Going back to the machine. A she-man from Bukavu, the machine didn't start out his career as a digger. He sold miscellaneous wares until all of his things were taken by the Rwandan-backed RCD, Rally for Congolese Democracy, during the Second Congolese War. He helped the army carry away his own things on his back. After the theft, he heard about the price that coltan ore was fetching, and so went into the forest to make a living for his family, but he has never been able to return home. Though he likes to joke that le retour c'est académique, returning is taken for granted. It's academic. When the price of coltan fell from $100 a kilo to $10 a kilo, the machine had debts that he needed to pay off to various financial backers, so he couldn't return to the city of Goma, his original home. Instead, he hung around in the forest, digging to make ends meet, while waiting for something to happen. When he heard that Bakumu trappers, looking for anything to make up for the lost value of coltan, and the animal populations that had been decimated by armies during the war, when he learned that they had discovered casterite and bauxite in the middle of the rainforest at a place that came to be called Bisie, this name I've mentioned before, Bakumu for it will always remain here. Now it's controlled by a foreign company called Alphamine, but I'll get back to that. The machine went there to work, to Bisie, along with what soon turned out to be nearly 20,000 others. This is a picture I took of one part of Bisie, not the mine itself, but where the butchers were. During that time, roughly 2003 to 2010, the machine says that he ate and drank like a king. But these days, the Toronto-based company Alphamine has taken advantage of the work of these artisanal miners and secured a contract from the government to drill. I don't know if you see that. They have done this in the context of the new American and European legislation that has provided the Congolese government and President Kabila with a pretext to shut down artisanal mining and bring in corporations in which the president is alleged to also be invested. A de facto embargo on artisanal mining has followed the official ban up until the present. As a result of conflict-free minerals legislation and the Congolese government's response, the machine and his friends have been evacuated from the site they discovered and developed. Who discovered it is a really complicated story and a bone of contention in and around Bisie. A small fraction of these people now work for Alphamine, building a road for a pittance. Alphamine, interestingly, is also a member of the International Tin Research Institute, which is carrying out the main conflict-free minerals traceability initiative in the area. This is from the internet. To ensure that minerals are conflict-free. All miners point out, this is a bag and tagging bags of minerals. All miners point out the absurdity of the notion that artisanal miners at Bisie are contributing to conflict and that their minerals are bloody, while the company Alphamine is being allowed to mine these minerals as if they were conflict-free. Quote, how does blood only exist in our minerals and not in those of the company, they ask. The machine jokes that because of Obama's law and the closure of Bisie, his physique no longer lives up to his name. His body has become a microcosm for the closure of movement in and around Bisie. When Bisie was open, if his boot touched the ground, it left behind a major imprint, a memory. But now he treads lightly on the earth. That's not all. Life around Bisie is especially dangerous now, as former miners join gangs and steal from people on the roads and in the forest. Moreover, the closure has tied up millions of dollars for businessmen who have taken loans from buyers in the towns and even out of country. Some of the higher-level hole owners are financing these gangs in the forest and were rumored to be planning an attack on Alphamine when I was there. Quote, Bisie was our security, the machine laments. Now the bandia in the forest, the bandits in the forest are thicker than the mosquitoes. On the value of non-transparency. Obviously, the name machine is a pseudonym. Many of the other miners at this bar also use pseudonyms. At our table alone, we have a Chuck Norris, a Rambo, a Snoop Dogg, a P. Diddy, and a Toronto. Alphamine is based in Toronto, so this joke name has that in mind. The city of Toronto was present at Bisie in more ways than one. Have you ever met an Obama? My Congolese research assistant asked the machine. Obama? The machine almost shrieks in delight, pointing to a small house. He's right over there. He works real hard, but he smokes too much pot. On the one hand, these names symbolize the fact that miners' work connects them to social fields that are global in scale. On the other hand, fake names help these workers avoid creditors, as the diggers' committees and PDGs, president, director, generals, like a CEO, the owner of a whole, in charge at the mine keep records of workers. There is simply no such thing as an artisanal miner who doesn't have a debt to someone, as this work cannot take place without a regular flow of money from middlemen to diggers in the form of food, beer, tools, and of course money. But an array of unpredictable and uncontrollable factors can make it so that reciprocal exchanges turn into strictly calculated debts that often don't get repaid in a timely fashion. And so diggers like the machine have to come up with adaptive strategies for dealing with people who could bring them harm. We are like snakes in the ground, always looking for a hole to crawl into, he laughs. The machine explains to me what he calls the 4 universal laws, really ethical principles of being a digger, no matter where these diggers are on Earth. All of them involve debt and the need to maintain invisibility. The opposite of what we will see is really the putative transparency that traceability schemes claim to be able to conjure into being. The first law is that artisanals, as he calls them, can't be afraid of debt. Lazima wewe na deni. They must be with debt. On the other hand, and this is the second principle, they are morally forbidden from selling their minerals on credit or taking on deni, and so must get their cash up front. The third principle is that diggers cannot accept or sign contracts, particularly with the middlemen to whom they sell. This refusal to sign contracts is about avoiding prison in case they can't meet the contract because of the many uncertainties of the mining trade, a luxury that middlemen who must sign contracts do not have. Not signing contracts is also a way of ensuring that others are not responsible for one's debt, which led to the fourth principle of diggers, according to the machine, which is that a digger's debt belongs only to him. The debt must be the outcome of a private, oral, and oral relationship between contracting persons based on a principle of trust which no one else should be liable for. Avoiding transparent visibility is part of the work of diggers. It allows them to be creative and spontaneous, supple, and to forge connections amongst distinct people, domains, and spiritual entities. And so the machine suggested invisibility and opacity are perhaps more genuine and authentic moral values than the false principles of transparency enacted in various conflict-free minerals interventions and tracking schemes. I've waded through enough court records in Goma to understand how critical these evasive strategies can be. Take the low-level trader's wife who had to flee to Uganda when the police came looking for her husband's house. She was arrested when she returned to Goma and has spent the last year in jail, while her husband, who had a loan, is secretly trying to pay it off by working at a militia-occupied gold mine in Ituri. Or the middleman who hung himself because the government was going after the home that his family lived in, and he and his children were to be forced back to the village. Or the 7 guys with holes in Bisie who had financial backing from an Indian in Kampala. When the mines closed, they couldn't pay back the loan money they owed, and entered different militias in the forest around the Bisie mine to try and earn as much of the money back as they could. All of these debt stories concern the rupture of social relations, the implosion of incremental time engendered by social networks, and the manufacturing of violence through legal efforts to legislate peace into existence from on high. The fetishes of traceability. Artisanal mining is, should be clear now, a creative response to the history of war and the expropriation of things, land, social relationships, and incremental temporality that were central to the war. The ingenuity of these workers is informed by a practical logic of inclusivity, the co-optation and interdigitation of different people, forces, and ostensible domains. It is this inclusivity and multiplicity that Congolese have in mind when they call the 3 T's peace-building minerals, where peace, again, is an ongoing inclusive process rather than a singular event. But if mining practice is based on intercalation, inclusion, and the translation and conversion of different dimensions of life, the state and the non-state, the living and the dead, the social and the natural, what happens when Congolese are confronted with an apparatus that sees separating these realms as a moral imperative, the only way to ensure that minerals are ritually purified of blood? Miners and traders, their backs to the wall, have warily and partially accepted a new regulatory system, transplanted onto pre-existing artisanal regulatory frameworks. This one comes from the high-tech corporations who are subject to Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act. In their efforts to be Dodd-Frank compliant, companies like Intel and HP have required their smelters to ensure that if they source from Congo or a neighboring country, they do so through a reliable, conflict-free system. With the cooperation of the Congolese government, the smelters have developed tracking schemes. The main tracking scheme, called Idjwi, and designed by Idjwi, the International Tin Research Institute, which again, Alphamine, which is displacing miners at Bisie, is part of, works like this. First, the Ministry of Mines and an international NGO determine whether a particular mine is conflict-free or green, meaning that a militia is not in control of it, or soldiers. After which they may initiate Idjwi in cooperation with the Ministry of Mines. Bagged 3 T's are tied with 2 sets of barcoded tags, one for negotiants or middlemen, and one for the mine itself, with reference numbers attached. The tags are supposed to be affixed to the bags at the site of extraction, where government officials from SESCAMP, the Small-Scale Mining Technical Service and Training Program, are supposed to do the work, and then again at the site of processing and sale to licensed negotiants, where government officials in the Ministry of Mines are supposed to do the tagging. Detailed accounts, including the tag numbers, the date, the location, the weight, the buyer, the price, and the transportation method, are supposed to be recorded in different logbooks depending on the node in the supply chain. Data collected by hand in these logbooks is then supposed to be uploaded onto a database located somewhere. The minerals are then supposed to make their way to specific comptoirs or buying houses in Goma, typically, that are participating in the project. These comptoirs, who also have their own logbooks, are in turn supposed to sell to specific smelters outside of Congo. At present, these are in Malaysia. Nothing is supposed to happen outside of this system, but of course it does all the time. Beyond recording mineral extraction and tracking minerals from one place to another, Idjwi is enacting a specific vision of how states and economies should interact with one another, mainly that state actors should remain separate from, but also monitor economic actors and processes. Such interventions are also predicated upon identifying, extracting, and separating out one domain from the other, the state from the non-state, for example, and so run counter to Congolese peacemaking practice, which is ultimately about interweaving formerly separated domains and practices. Most importantly, for diggers, the Idjwi solution has the probably unintended effect of limiting the field of selling options for diggers and low-level middlemen, thus allowing higher-level middlemen to set the price, and win the ongoing war over price, which defines the Congolese mineral trade. The Idjwi intervention also represents the imposition of a software design logic onto the system of nation states and national sovereignty, and consists in an attempt to change the geopolitical order into something like what Benjamin Bratton calls the stack, a vertically thick and layered rather than horizontal geopolitical cartography. Of course, it is ironic that the corporate response to the notion that there is potentially violent geologic materiality in digital devices is to propose a technological fix to double down on digital solutionism. But the aforementioned Idjwi plan is not how things actually work on the ground, and it would be quite dangerous if it did. I'm reminded here of Jane Geyer's Marginal Gains, in which she argues that variability, multiplicity, and unpredictability in currencies, prices, modes of value, and types of economic actors has a very long history in African life. Attempts to create formal bureaucratization have served to augment rather than standardize or homogenize the multiplicity of interconnected systems. As she puts it, economic action in much of Africa involves, quote, creating and discovering disjunctures in the architecture of formality, such that multiplicity emerges through formalization. In this particular instance, miners and traders operating from non-validated sites have options. The most straightforward one is to pay off state authorities so they can move their minerals in the way they want, or to simply illegally buy an Idjwi tag from Ministry of Mines officials when they get to the border city of Bukavu or Goma. The new tag will say that the minerals come from a validated green site, e.g. minerals from Bisie get a tag saying they're from Itabero. In Bisie, this strategy has so far prevented an all-out war. State actors have allowed miners to move their stock from this non-validated site, so technically not conflict-free, through validated sites, thus washing the minerals so they can be transparently clean for the companies. Otherwise, people with thousands of dollars in their holes and their financial backers would be at a loss and might call on the militias in the forest to their aid. In other words, Idjwi tags, which come from outside DR Congo, do not function in the way they are intended, but perform the work of fetishes, comforting foreign buyers, and enabling international business to continue. But that does not mean those interventions have no effect or are completely superfluous. For example, sometimes Idjwi finds itself locked in and contributing to conflicts between traders and diggers that it cannot control and that are outside of its purview of ensuring that minerals are conflict-free in the very limited sense of not being under the control of militarized groups. These conflicts, at times violent, occur between links in the supply chain and encourage those involved in the trade to reflect on Idjwi's complicity in creating low-level monopolies which encourage violence because they clamp down on the movement that is required to flourish in an economy predicated on radically fluctuating prices and general conditions. This complicity of the tracking scheme became clear to me when I conducted research for about a month in Rubaya, the town of Rubaya in North Kivu. Rubaya did not exist before the coltan boom in 2000. When the coltan boom and the war coincided, there were suddenly 27 foreign buying houses, or comptoirs, in Goma, many of them buying coltan from Rubaya. At that point, 6 people who had been digging and selling minerals in what came to be called Rubaya decided that given the multiple militarized players that were coming into Rubaya and making claims, it would be a good idea to, quote, look for papers, as they put it. They went to Goma and they, quote, bought papers for the entire carrier, the entire mine, from the occupying government, the Rally for Congolese Democracy, which was backed by Rwanda. So they bought their papers in Goma from the RCD. At around the same time, a Congolese Tutsi with American citizenship, I'll call him Joseph, started doing business in Rubaya and came up with an alternative idea. He flew to the then very fictive capital of Kinshasa to buy his own papers. This was the middle of the Second Congolese War, and they said that the Ministry of Mines folks in Kinshasa, at the time essentially a foreign country, thought Joseph was insane. Because at the time there was, quote, no conversation or understanding between the RCD government in the east and the central government in Kinshasa. When he returned, Joseph had papers from Kinshasa, national papers, but he never showed them to anyone, waiting for the RCD to leave before doing so. When the Coltan price collapsed in 2001, most of the comptoirs left. Those 6 people with their papers from the RCD in Goma remained as the recognized owners of that place, but life was at an all-time low. Middlemen sold their homes in Goma to pay off the debts they had accrued to their financial backers, and some returned to live in the villages. In 2004, after the Sun City agreements in South Africa, comptoirs re-entered in this new context under a new theoretically unified government constituted by the reaggregation of warring groups into the Congolese army and state bureaucracy. That's a hotel in Rubaya. Welcome to Sun City. The prices producers were receiving improved modestly during this time, until 2010, when President Kabila closed artisanal mining and everything collapsed again. When President Kabila agreed to reopen mining, one condition was that the International Tin Research Institute, Idjwi, again backed by Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and Intel, be involved in the process of traceability. At this point, Joseph began brandishing the papers for his cooperative, now called MHash, claiming that the entire mine belonged to him. But the other 6 guys still had papers too, only their papers were from the province. And by most interpretations, Joseph's national documents were higher than Juya theirs. When Joseph, meaning MHash, tried to refuse all other PDGs, President Director Generals, or CEOs, and that's a term that comes from the history of Belgian colonial mining, but it's a term given to someone who is the recognized owner of a whole. When he tried to refuse them the right to access their holes, conflict ensued. To resist MHash, the other whole owners banded together to form what they called a cooperative, but what others might call a rival cartel. They claimed that in the beginning, Joseph had the smallest space of all of them, but that he had performed magendo, illegal acts, a term also used for smuggling, to get these papers from Kinshasa. When Joseph tried to reach Rubaya, the cooperative closed the road, and he went 3 months without being able to show up at his site. At this point, Joseph changed the name of his company to SMB. Companies like Diggers change their names often. He then entered into a contract with Idjwi, which assumed that Joseph was the concession owner since he had these papers from Kinshasa. Here again, Idjwi, a consortium of outside smelters, assumed the sovereignty and preeminence of the nation over the province, even though, according to the Sun City Accords, the papers that were bought from the province during the war are legally valid. Idjwi also assumed that, according to the 2010 Congolese Mining Code, everyone at Rubaya had to sell to SMB, so they would have a monopoly, which at the time was the only company that had come to an agreement with Idjwi. As one member of the Diggers Cooperative put it to me, quote, Idjwi believes in the papers of Kinshasa more than the papers of the province. Note here the interest in pacifying international outsiders with their own fetishes, identifying what the other sees as magically agentive and giving it to them. You want tags? We'll give you tags. Idjwi and an NGO had already held numerous seminars in Rubaya to teach people what Idjwi was, explaining that the scheme would allow middlemen to sell their minerals without being hassled and taxed by multiple state authorities. These seminars seemed to persuade other middlemen to, quote, go with SMB, in part because they would be supported by foreign buyers persuaded by SMB's Kinshasa documents. In this newly empowered position, Joseph's SMB now with the support of Idjwi, entered into an agreement with the middlemen, including the former concession owners, stating that if the latter brought minerals to be tagged by Idjwi and sold by SMB, these middlemen would be paid within 2 weeks. Middlemen now began bringing their stones with an average of 730 tons a month passing through Idjwi and the company SMB. But things started to change when there was a falling out between Joseph and his buyer in the United States. Suddenly, it was a month or more before people received money from SMB, which caused production to go down, since middlemen couldn't forward money and supplies to diggers. Some middlemen looked for interest-bearing loans to see them through. As one trader explained, you're supposed to get your money from the buying house ahead of time, so there can be movement, and you won't accrue debts. But if that doesn't happen, you can get a debt. After 3 months, you won't be a businessman anymore. The breakdown of relations between SMB and the middlemen started in May of 2015. By September, there was war brewing in Rubaya between the diggers and the middlemen, and in Goma between the middlemen and the comptoir, SMB. SMB's new Chinese buyer allegedly wouldn't buy the minerals without seeing them, and the negotiants wouldn't allow the minerals to leave Goma until they had received their money, according to the contract that they had signed. 150 middlemen camped outside the Goma office in an effort to ensure that SMB wouldn't depart with the $5 million worth of coltan that the negotiants had sold to the company in accordance with the contract, saying that they would be paid within 2 weeks. It had been 3 months, and that debts would never exceed $1 million. Even more was going on here. The world market price had dropped again after previously experiencing a burst, and so the value of what the company SMB possessed had decreased. SMB was waiting for the price to go up. Unlike the middlemen and the diggers, the comptoir was in a position to use time like a weapon, holding on to the minerals to try and get the best price they could. As one miner put it, because of their use of time, SMB, the comptoir, can destroy everyone else. And now people won't have money. And any forwarded loans to cover the costs of production will come from SMB. So SMB will be like a money lender and also a comptoir. And so a relationship based on mutual reciprocal exchange and trust has imploded into debt, which threatens to become war, a war of papers in Goma, and in Rubaya, a war of weapons. Idjwi, which is supposed to be an agent of regulation, and through regulation peace, now finds itself at the center of a violent conflict that it helped to make, partly because it assumed the legitimacy of one set of bureaucratic fetishes over another. They did not exactly cause the conflict, but they contributed to it by limiting the range of action for diggers and middlemen in a highly volatile economy, making it so that those on the lowest end of the commodity chain were the most vulnerable. But Idjwi is ultimately able to pull out in order to conceal the violence of its own practice. As a Ministry of Mines official who hadn't been paid in months because of low production in Rubaya, they get bonuses based on production at the mines. Put it to me, conflict is like poison for Idjwi. If anything happens, they'll just disappear. Clearly, efforts to ritually purify minerals of violence entail the potential for violence. This became personally clear to me when one of my research assistants, who I'll call Nelson, was paid a visit at his house by his father-in-law, a police officer in Goma. Nelson's father-in-law let him know that a couple of dangerous-looking guys had shown up at the precinct with his license plate number. These men said they wanted the police to go into their computer and find the car owner's full name and residence so they could speak to him. They only had Nelson's license number. After running a search, Nelson's father-in-law realized that his own son-in-law was indeed the owner of the car. To protect Nelson, he misdirected the men, saying that he couldn't find the registration number in the computer. Later, the same guys went to the local ANR office, Internal Security, but Nelson had a friend there as well, and the same scenario repeated itself. It turns out that the guys looking for Nelson were working as security for SMB in Goma and were following up on us after our visit to Rabaya. They believed, incorrectly I'm sure, that one of our visits to talk to middlemen there was connected to the recent insurrection of these very middlemen who were presently surrounding their office in Goma. Nelson later changed his license plates to avoid being pursued by these men, and a year later the situation has quieted down and the company seems to be preoccupied with other things. We had all the necessary papers to carry out research from state authorities in Rabaya and the province, but these company actors saw the entire town of Rabaya and all of its occupants as part of their concession. Judging from my experience in other towns participating in the Idjwi scheme, I believe this anxiety was also related to the fact that SMB was an Idjwi partner, and they knew company representatives from Motorola and elsewhere would be following up on things. They wanted to be able to manage impressions of the site as much as possible. Regulatory actors at Rabaya and other towns participating in this form of regulation are aware that tracking schemes do not work in the way they are intended, and are worried that outsiders will reveal this game to the world, thus scaring off outside investors again. In short, and here's the more general point, they want to continue manipulating the corporate fetishization of transparency and technology to their advantage, in essence playing corporate actors off with their own fetishes so that business can continue, but can't do this if the fetishes are exposed as being fetishes. Or, to paraphrase David Graeber, as gods in the process of being constructed. That's all. Thank you. Thank you. Guess I'll take questions. Yes?
What kind of extraction tax does the Congolese government get? How much of it have they collected? What they collected, have they invested in?
That's a good and complicated question, and I don't know if there's a way to really answer that question, because, first of all, there are two different levels of tax. There's what Congolese call tax, which is state authorities kind of, coming and essentially asserting their right to a certain amount of money or minerals. So that is called tax in Congo, and I have called it tax here as well. But it's not what you have in mind when you say tax. So that amount of tax is something that is negotiated on the ground, or that type of tax is something that is negotiated on the ground, and is subject to different arguments, about what a soldier, for example, should get for protecting a mine and for offering protection, which is predicated in part on what is happening at that particular moment in time. Is there a militia nearby, for example? What right does an immigration figure, authority from DGM, from the Office of Immigration, have to collect tax at a mine? Well, there are migrants who come, and so immigration would seem to be someone who deserves tax. So all these people are, what about internal security? What about the customary authorities or the legal autochthones? Tax is being paid to all of these people, not all of whom are state actors, some of whom are, some of whom are not. But then there's the province and the taxes of the province. And, that is something that people claim, state authorities claim, that since regulation has gone into effect, that the province is getting more money through tax and getting money through that kind of tax for the first time. But I don't actually have good solid figures on that, and it's actually one of the things that I want to try and find out to the extent that I can find that out when I return this summer. Yes?
So you gave us some examples of ways that miners can kind of work around the kind of bag and tag schemes, and also an example of a mine where it was creating a lot of conflict.
Hmm?
But if you look at the big picture overall, do you think that there is kind of a sort of stability or a tentative stabilization, or is this likely to erupt further kind of overall if you look at mining in general?
I think it's, well, I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think it's difficult to, I'm not sure I know the answer. I think that, first of all, regulation is occurring in mostly with the 3 T's, right? So not with gold and diamonds. So those actors, it has, one thing that has happened as a result of this is that those military actors who were involved in mining before, and also militias that were involved in mining, many of them have gone into gold and diamonds, or have gone further away into the forest. So they're still involved, but they're involved in a different way. Or they've gone into other substances like timber, for example, and not mining. I can say that one thing that has happened is that diggers are getting less money than they were getting before. And partly this has to do with, in certain places, this has to do with the fact that that comptoirs have monopolies now because they're involved in this Idjwi scheme, and they're the only people you can legally sell to. And if you want to do something illegal, then you have to have money. You have to pay state authorities to be able to do that. So it privileges people with money. And those at the lower end are having a difficult time. If they don't have land, if they can't, do agriculture or something else, that encourages some to engage in other criminal activities or to join militias. Right? So insecurity is fostered by poverty and by the inability to make ends meet, essentially. So. So this is not, these regulatory efforts have made that worse, I would say. But at the same time, each mine is kind of its own world, so it plays out differently in each place. That helps. So it's difficult to talk about mining in general because there's so many different small mines and of different sizes, and large mines and small mines. And yes?
Yeah, following off that question, with Idjwi regulation, who do you think has benefited economically most? You said the comptoirs have, but do you think Idjwi corporations ultimately benefited?
I'm trying to think of who benefits most. Well, I can tell you who benefits least are, on the one hand, diggers, and also state figures who aren't getting money from taxing people, and who therefore have to create opportunities for miners and low-level traders to move their minerals so that they can also make an income. But certainly those comptoirs that are involved in the scheme are doing well and are making money. So I would say that those companies who have been able to use their papers effectively in order to get a contract that the government recognizes, they have benefited. Now, saying that also, the PDGs, the sort of higher level, they're artisanal miners. They're considered to be artisanal miners, but they're not actually the ones engaged in the work of digging stuff out of the ground, but they organize labor at the mine. They complain a lot, and used to complain a lot, and still complain a lot, about the multiple state authorities, the various people coming to them wanting to collect tax. And so they hoped, and continue to hope, that regulation will simplify that, will make it so they don't have to pay as many different kinds of taxes, but will only pay, tax once. But what has happened is that, and this is why it's one of the reasons why it's difficult to generalize, is that regulation has gone hand in hand with kicking out artisanal miners. right? So making it, for example, that Bisie is no longer a place for artisanal mining, and which is now characterized as being illegal, even though it's not actually technically legal, according to the Congolese mining code, and giving over a place to a company, right? So those PDGs, those people who were sort of like higher level artisanal miners, I guess, they're not really artisanal miners, middlemen really, of a sort. They have embraced regulation, but then have been dismayed by its consequences, I think is what you can say, and by the unintended or unpredicted outcome of it. I'm not sure.
Go ahead. This is a question you're not going to be able to answer. But you mentioned, do the best you can. But you mentioned that the big boom was in 2000, and things have been changing from there. Does this seem like a sustainable operation? Are they running out of minerals? Are they running out of places to continue mining? Or do you think this is something like? Do you think this could be last for decades?
Right. One thing I'd really like to do is to get a geologist and maybe an ecologist and I don't know who else, someone else, and get one of these interdisciplinary NSF grants to go and answer exactly these kinds of questions. Also about like the ecological consequences of artisanal mining as opposed to other kinds of mining or farming even, and all these things that I don't know anything about. But which I presume could be known. I think that though, it's not really about a sort of limited amount of, although of course there is a finite amount of things in the ground, but in the immediate, in immediate terms, that's probably not what's at issue. What is more at issue is the kind of the embargo or the decreased demand from the outside, which is affecting price, and making it so that people aren't digging the stuff out of the ground. And so the supply has gone down. But I don't think there is a geologic limit to supply, but I don't have the sense that it's imminent in any way. If that answers the question. Yes.
You mentioned, or you spoke about the economic, or improved economic opportunities that happen in these sort of villages or communities that have mining communities sort of implanted on them, right? What are some of the other social implications that are occurring in these communities as they expand? I imagine they're going from 300 community members to over, 40,000? What does that look like? And could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And again, it depends a lot. So some places did not have a history of mining at all, right? But it's hard to find a place that had absolutely no history at all of mining in the sense of never having been mapped or been the concession of a Belgian mining company. But there was not a kind of social experience of mining or an economic experience of mining, like, for example, Bisie. Bisie was, an area that this one clan hunted in and trapped and did some limited agriculture, and then suddenly there were 20,000 people there. So it wasn't even a village, or it was just a place where people hunted. And when those people came, actually it was those trappers, that clan, that set about encouraging those people to come. They set about promoting their place as a place where miners could come. And they did this in the wake of the armies coming in and killing off the animals, right? And so they were looking for other ways, to get money and they started, they knew that coltan had value and there were these stones that had value. So they started looking for these things. And there are different stories about how that happened and who was to blame and within the clan, and it's a subject of much discussion within that particular clan. But then they came, and then 20,000 people came, and they set about trying to control that as much as possible. And they assumed from the beginning, well, in the beginning they assumed, it seems, that from my conversations with them, that they would have sole authority over this. But then all those miners were followed by state authorities, and the state came into being kind of following those miners. Came into being at Bisie and took different forms at different times. That is, the state took different forms at different times. And eventually the Ministry of Mines, one representative from the Ministry of Mines ended up like publicly beating one member of this clan there in order to teach him that the state had authority over this place, and that he would get, that the Bagandula would get a certain percentage. Anyways, that's a long story in answer to your question. But so there, obviously, it was extremely transformative, and it culminated in this company coming in. In other places, there's a history of mining, and it's a mining town. For example, like Kalima in Manyema is a coltan mining town going back to the 1940s, right? And hasn't been a coltan mining town for a very long time, but all the company buildings are there, and the social hall where the Belgians hung out and drank, and the pool table is still there, and there's a basketball court, but it's all, inhabited by the descendants of the company. And so for them, this is kind of, a potential return of a certain kind of life, but of course very different, because the people coming in are not from there, and they're youth, and they're artisanal miners. And so that is kind of an experience as an ambivalent thing, to say the least. I would say, I guess the short answer to your question is that it's experienced as troublesome and radically transformative, but plays out very differently in different places, depending on the history of mining. Yes. No, I'm sorry. Yes.
What kind of presence do companies have on the ground? Do they do audits, inspections? Do they have offices? How do they monitor the process?
No, they don't have offices, inspection.
About the companies that buy the
Right, the comptoirs. So typically, no. The comptoirs are located in Goma and Bukavu, the hope is that the government, the state workers, particularly the Ministry of Mines, will be carrying out through Idjwi in these places where Idjwi has gone into effect, which is a small percentage of all the different mines, will be carrying out that work of inspection through the tracking schemes. Otherwise, there isn't really inspection outside of that. There is a Ministry of Mines, but the Ministry of Mines is not actually following through with Idjwi in the way that it was intended.
Yeah, my point is this software companies that make these iPhones and what other devices, what kind of assurance they get when they buy those minerals? Who provides that assurance?
Right. Well, the assurance is actually the tags themselves, right? That the tags have passed through these different links in the chain, and that allows them to be able to say that they have done their due diligence with respect to inspecting the supply chain. Again, the Dodd-Frank Act only says that they have to do their due diligence, which is to do the best they can to figure out what the supply chain looks like, and not to absolutely 100% ensure that the minerals are quote-unquote conflict-free, whatever exactly that means. So the short answer is they don't have any assurance or guarantee. Yes, Ralph.
You talked a lot about people going off and joining militias. Could you tell us more about what these militias do when you are what that means?
Yeah.
Free.
It's a good question, because militia is this really blanket term. Because in the, so there is one really kind of major militia, the FDLR, which is loosely connected to or descended from the Hutu Interahamwe. And they occupy much of the region in which I've been working, or are nearby. Then there are Mai militias that are indigenous militias that are, well, the mythology of them is that they emerged to resist occupation by foreigners. And they use indigenous magic, they use the forest, the insects, everything in the forest, everything that is autochthonous as magic to resist foreign invasion. But some Mai, the story goes, have become essentially corrupted by these minerals and the demand for these minerals and the money that comes from them, and have gone from being protectors and of conduits of this autochthonous power to being something more like an invading militia themselves. And then there are gangs, essentially, that sometimes I'm going to say just gangs. This is another subject of debate in Congo. Are these Mai, or are they FDLR, or are they just gangs? Who are essentially people who don't have anything else or any other opportunities, and who have bought weapons from other groups and to form a gang in the forest. Some of them are soldiers who left the army because they weren't getting enough opportunities through the army. Some of them are miners. Some of them are middlemen. So different groups of people. And sometimes they will refer to themselves as Mai, or a kind of Mai, like Rayam Tumboki, which means the infuriated citizens, who refer to themselves as Mai, but others say they're not genuine Mai.
Are they extorting money from people? Are they stealing? What are they doing?
Yeah, they attack mines and they steal from people. They steal from people on the roads. They steal from miners and traders as they walk through the forest. Businessmen, as they're walking through the forest, they waylay them and rob them, primarily. Sometimes they will attack a mine and steal as much as they can at the mine. Sometimes they will even attack a town.
Do they sell minerals to these?
Yes.
So I know there are a couple of hands up, and I know that Jim sees you. But I would like us, the Center for International Studies is hosting a reception for us outside here. So I'd like to invite us to continue the conversation outside as we mill around informally, and thank all of you for attending. Jim, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. They're all really fascinating. Thanks for inviting me to.